So before we officially begin, I do want to begin by just thanking our wonderful friends of the library for their generous support of tonight's program. I especially want to thank Amy Bass, who is President Emerita of the Friends, for introducing me to Dr. Nkosi. The library is very proud to be hosting tonight's event, and I feel especially fortunate to have the opportunity to be in conversation with Morley this evening. So I'm going to give you a little bit of biographical background about him, and then we'll start to dive into what is a fascinating life story. So in terms of some background about our guest tonight, he was born in Johannesburg under apartheid, and he was actively involved in resisting the racist policies of South Africa, something we will hear much more about shortly. He left South Africa in 1960 and lived and worked in exile in various parts of Africa, Europe, and the United States, where he eventually earned his PhD in economics from the New School in New York City. It was during this time that he met his wife, Joanna, who is in attendance tonight. They met at an anti-apartheid protest in New York. Dr. Nkosi has worked in a number of African countries as a development economist and consultant for various organizations. Since his return to South Africa in 1991, Dr. Nkosi has been an executive of numerous business and not-for-profit organizations, including managing partner for Morley Nkosi Associates. He has been active throughout his life as a social and political activist devoted to progressive values and movements internationally, nationally, and at the community level. So, and this really just barely scratches the surface of Dr. Nkosi's incredible life story. And as I said, we're going to dive deeper into the chapters of your life that I outlined there. But I first, I want to just quickly give everybody just some historical context. And again, I'm certainly no expert on this subject, but I want everyone to have at least some idea of the political and economic history that is part of Morley's life story. So while we can look to the history books and find that apartheid in South Africa was established in 1948, but the history of segregation, enslavement, and labor structure begins almost 300 years earlier. It begins with the Dutch East India Company in the 1650s, which began to use South Africa as a stopover point in their trade route to India and points east. This stopover point eventually became a colony, which took over land that then needed laborers to support the colony. And as we know from many other histories of European colonial powers, this labor often took the form of forced or coerced labor or enslavement. Initially, the Dutch imported enslaved people from other countries, and as the colonial control shifted to the British in 1795, the system of controlled labor became even more developed. As the colony expanded, more land was taken over, and South Africans who were living there were forced onto reservations, unfairly taxed, and this labor force became an essential part of the growing mining industry in South Africa. Laborers were moved to where they were needed, and the local population of South Africans were segregated and controlled by the British, who exploited them for their own purposes. My whole point here really is just to say that the system of segregation and the many layers of labor structure have a much longer history in South Africa than the 1948 establishment of apartheid. And we'll be talking in further depth about the systems of labor control, which included a token system, a letter system, and eventually the establishment of the pass laws, which play a central role in tonight's story. So with that background now being laid out, I want to turn things over to you, Morley. And I know that we have a lot of ground to cover, so we're going to do our best to discuss the many important chapters of your life. But let's, as I think seems logical, let's start at the beginning by learning about your time growing up in Johannesburg and you're going to school and some of the jobs that you had.
Jeff, thank you very much. That was an excellent introduction for somebody who has just dived into this history. Thank you very much, because it sets the stage. But before I start, can I say thank you, to Amy, Jeff, and the friends of the library for hosting this event. I don't want to take that for granted. Now, to start with, my upbringing is very important because I grew up in a very religious household. My father was an evangelist of what is called the Dutch Reformed Church. Consequently, my schooling was influenced by attending mission schools, Dutch Reformed Church mission school, as well as the Methodist mission schools. And Unfortunately, when I finished high school, my parents did not have enough resources to send me to university. Not that it would have been easy if they had the money, because there were very few universities that admitted blacks then. Okay. So I had to enter the labor market. Now, in the labor market, I really started at the beginning. I started with being a tea boy and then graduated to being a messenger, graduated to being a filing clerk, graduated to being a chauffeur. Now, the chauffeur part is extremely important and really tells you a little more, because the person I became a chauffeur for was the first Jewish cabinet minister in the country. When the government of the United Party lost power to the nationalists in 1948, he obviously went out, and he became the chairman of what was called the Timber Trade Association in South Africa. That's when I met him. And this man's name is Dr. Henry Clarkman. Very important in the development of the NIH in England, because himself and an Englishman and some guy from India were developing insurance policies for the respective countries. Anyway, after being a chauffeur, I decided, I need to earn a little more money. And the way I could do it was become a truck driver. I became a truck driver for the largest shop fronting firm in South Africa called Frederick Sage. That company is extremely important because it really helped develop the shop fronts that Harrods in London has. It also was very instrumental in doing some of the woodwork that you find in the House of Commons. It came to South Africa in the early 1900s, and I managed to join it in the early 50s as a driver. I was promoted later to becoming an assistant storeman. I mentioned that deliberately because this was a huge company. There were over 450 people there, 250 blacks, 200 whites. And in that context, there was a lot of abuse and racial divisions and so on. So I was really shocked when I was offered the job of being an assistant stores manager, where there was a white guy who was a little older, and they just asked him to leave, and they put me in that spot. And then I asked the question, listen, with all the kind of tension that exists between white and black workers here, if I become a store person, how am I going to be protected from the abuses that I don't need from the artisans? And the head of this organization, a Scotsman, said, listen, I'll tell every shop, there were 5 different shops, that whatever they do, they have to be on that behavior as they come down to the stores. The long and the short of it, there are ways in which you get abused. They don't have to call you a kafir, which is the equivalent of a nigger. They can always talk to you as my black friend, which has innuendos that indicate that, you're not like them and so on. I suffered that, but I managed to run the shop very effectively. Then I wanted to move up. Now I had to become an apprentice to the drafting shop. So I approached the head of the organization. I said, listen, I think I've done very well as a driver and a long distance truck driver at it. I now need to move into an area where my education might be even more useful. He says, where, Morley? I said, in the drafting shop. He says, do you realize that if you walked into that shop as an apprentice, 44 draftsmen would just put their tools down and leave? I then said, there's no alternative. I have to get out. That's how I left the company. I was fortunate enough because I had earned enough money. I patted around looking for opportunities, and I will go quickly onto what happened there because it's also instructive. I decided I wanted to sell advertising space from nowhere. I knew very little about advertising space. So I went into a very large book and stationery shop, and I bought Carnegie Dale's books on how to to sell. I can't seem to find the exact title. All I'm running into is how to influence people, how to win friends and influence people.
Yeah.
And I says to myself, but I don't remember a long title like that. But the Dale Carnegie books, two of them, were very helpful because they gave me some hope that I could make it. Somewhere in the process, from nowhere, I see this study done by J. Walter Thompson, the largest international advertising company in the world then. It's still a very powerful multinational now. They had done a study on the South African market, and they had actually done a fantastic job because they disaggregated it into sectors of the economy. And within those sectors, they also went to the labor and went into the demographics of the population to show you what ethnic group was involved in what sector. That gave me more courage that, selling advertising space would be fantastic. It's that really started African advertising. And from then on, I had enough resources. And I then met a group of people who were talking politics, Africanist politics, that was influenced by the changes in Ghana. Ghana had gotten independence in 1957. And the Africanists were following the developments of Ghana. And they were talking about how really things could be made to move faster in South Africa than they had been in the past. I became a member of the Africanists, and we formed the Pan-Africanist Congress in 1959. I was elected as a member of the regional executive of the Witwatersrand. Witwatersrand is the largest metropolitan area. It's really the financial financial area of the country. And later I became vice president of this organization then. Now, one would ask the question, what prompted me to go into politics? It's the experiences that I've just recounted in the various jobs I had, including the discrimination that I saw in the church. All those really alienated me to the point where it was very easy to recognize the importance of a political activist along the Africanist lines. I became a political activist, and it's in that process that a lot of things began to unfold.
So
Now,
Morley, I'm going to interrupt you right there. That's a really interesting evolvement and a significant involvement in your life. And um, for some folks, when faced with injustices, they just kind of make do or turn the other way and just throw up their hands, kind of thing. There's others who, like yourself, decide this is wrong and this is something I need to act on. So I think you were just explaining where some of the experiences you had drove you to that. But I think you kind of have to be a hopeful person in some ways to say that if I get involved in this and work hard, I can change things. So can you just talk a little bit about that experience for yourself at that time?
well, what I knew, not as much as I know now, was the history of the struggles of our people, various ethnic groups across the country, against colonialism, against segregation, against British imperialism, and of course, the African National Congress had been around since 1910, thereabouts, and they had done everything they could to really pursue the nonviolent path of, for the struggle. And but they hadn't gotten anywhere with delegations that have left South Africa to England and came back with nothing. And then, but in the meantime, the policies that were made in Britain, did not change. They were absolutely on target in terms of their own interests that disregarded us completely. That became clear in 1910 when peace was made between two adversaries, the British, who were determined to control the country, and the Afrikaners, who were there and came there in the 1600s through the Dutch East India Company. So the compromise was signed off by Lord Milner, where he said, you know, it's important to make peace between us and dispense with the nigger, he is quoted as having said, because in our case, you know, we're dispensable people. Now, when you know that part of the history, you begin to realize that, you know what, after 1948, for a young person like myself, if you're conscious of that history, something has to be done. If the people who preceded me, okay, my countrymen who fought as hard as they could, who struggled against the system, failed, we need to move on. And our target became getting rid of the system that controls who you are, where you live, who your parents are, what ethnic group you belong to, whether you've been employed in the last few days, and where do you live, and have you paid your taxes. That past system, which you articulated so well, came from slavery, where they used a coin which identified the slave's owner, and then the letter for the road, which said what this slave was going to, where was this slave going to, whose slave it was it, and then the pass system, which was modernized by the British in the 1840s, and then in comes the Afrikaners after 1948, and take that foundation and work on it in a much more sophisticated fashion, because the economy has now grown tremendously since 1840 or since the 1650s. So
Yeah,
I walked into this situation with an understanding of where my people came from.
that's very well described there. I think that the idea of my historical introduction there was just to say that there was layer upon layer upon layer of labor structure and more importantly control of the population that continued to become even more structured and embedded in South Africa. And I think those systems leading up to the pass laws kind of leads up to
Yeah.
where some of your political involvement.
Right. Just to cap that question that you asked, I came back from Durban on the Saturday of the 19th of March, 1960, having got the biggest account you can get for full page ad, okay? And I was doing very well. Little did I know that, you know, I knew that on Monday of that on the coming Monday, we would be demonstrating against the past system that I've just outlined. I had no problems, Jeff, in packing my stuff, putting it aside, not knowing whether I'll go to jail for a long period of time or not. It didn't bother me. Instead, I was very eager on just putting the business aside, getting on with the struggle, and that really makes the point.
Absolutely. And I imagine as that decision was made, you must have known some of the risks and dangers, obviously, that were involved in that. But I obviously your motivation to pursue it clearly won out, and I think
Absolutely, I wasn't afraid.
that really takes us, I think, into
Changes.
yes, I think so. So I think for our next chapter that we're gonna cover here, we're very fortunate to have a very special guest who's joining us tonight. We're very happy to have, excuse me, Morley's daughter, Tenji Nkosi, joining us tonight. I'm going to read a little bit of some background about her because she has certainly a extensive and impressive resume as well. So she'll join us in a moment. But Tenjiwe Nkosi was born in New York and currently lives and works in Johannesburg. She is a South African American painter and multimedia artist. Tenji obtained her BA from Harvard University and her MFA from the School of Visual Arts in New York. She divides her time between studio work, performance, and navigating the field of art as social practice. Her extensive resume includes solo and group exhibitions in various galleries and universities around the world. She has received numerous grants and fellowships in support of her creative work. Tenji is the recipient of the Tolman Award for Visual Arts in 2019 and Philippe Wamba Prize in African Studies in 2004. I could go on and on. Her resume is very impressive, but we are very excited to have the opportunity for Tenji to join us today. And she's going to read a passage from her father's book, which relates to this part of the timeline that we are at right now. So I am going to, let's see. I'm just trying to spotlight. I think hopefully, there we go. Great. So welcome, Tenji. We're thrilled to have you here, and so glad you could be part of tonight's event. I'm going to turn things over to you. I know you have a passage, some passages from your father's book that you're going to share with us.
Great, thanks, Jeff. So just to give a little bit of context, this is about a specific event that happens in the lead up to Morley, my father, leaving South Africa. In a few minutes that felt like a lifetime, I saw Stanley and Ruby being herded into the bedroom where I was sitting up. Stanley and Ruby's eyes looked like they were going to pop out. They were frightened. I was in another world full of turmoil when one of the policemen asked who I was and why I was there. My response was that I was John Dube and had come from Springs, which is in the East Rand, to visit my friends, Stanley and Ruby. He did not ask for my pass, and I did not have one. If I had it and was willing to show it to him, it would have revealed my real name and where I came from. Fortunately, no one among these detectives was familiar with the name John Dube, nor did anyone catch the significance of a name associated with the founding member of a political party, the African National Congress. They turned around with Stanley and Ruby in front of them and headed for the front door, through which they had hurriedly entered the house. Just as they were about to open the door and step out, one of them noticed a beautiful and horizontally long radiogram near the door. Out of curiosity and perhaps envy, he pulled open one drawer. My brother had been a radio broadcaster for the SABC, the South African Broadcasting Corporation's rediffusion for Black people. During those years, he had accumulated a large collection of vinyl records, which filled the drawers of the radiogram and other boxes in the house. But in the drawer, the security officer had opened was a collection of records, on top of which was the latest issue of Bantu magazine. All I heard was a jubilant shrill from one of them, saying, "Dit is nou wat ons soek," translated into English from Afrikaans is, "Now this is what we're looking for." For them, this was a significant discovery. For me, it turned out to signal the end of my road in my homeland. I jumped out of bed in my pajamas to see what this find was all about. How I waded into and pushed through the 4 security agents, including Stanley and Ruby, to see what had been found, I don't recall. When I saw the cover of the magazine, I instantly realized what had happened. When paging through the magazine, they had discovered the reports. I was 3 minutes late in collecting the previous day at 5 in the afternoon. Apparently, when I did not show up at exactly 5 o'clock to pick up the typed versions of these reports, my friend had somehow found my brother and entrusted both the typed and handwritten versions with him in the hope that he would pass these on to me. The night before, when I showed up unexpectedly and found him engaged in heated debates with other political activists, he forgot to tell me that he had my incriminating reports in the house. Had he told me, I definitely would not have spent the night in the township. Now, my valuable work was in the hands of the secret police. The individuals mentioned in the reports were in danger of being arrested. With a certain amount of cautious brazenness, I asked to see what they had found. A little taken aback by my intrusiveness, they allowed me to see what they had discovered. They showed me the two types of reports. In a split second, I noticed my handwritten reports alongside the typed ones. I interjected what I thought was an important observation. I told the security officers that the handwriting on the reports was definitely not that of my friend Stanley. I knew his handwriting. What they were looking at was Stanley's younger brother's handwriting, Morley. I was trying to save my brother from serving a long prison sentence because of me. I went on to say, if my friend tried to write like his brother, he could not. This conversation was conducted in fluent Afrikaans, as always, under such circumstances. My unsolicited intervention was followed by a quick and angry response by one of the officers. Waar is die bliksem? Where is the scoundrel? They wanted to know. Very reassuringly, I replied that the scoundrel was at his home in Georgegach. They said that they had been there several times, but could not find him. I urged them to go there because it was still very early in the morning. It was close to 6 a.m. With an air of confidence, like someone very familiar with Morley's movements, I said that they would definitely find him there. They were excited and felt reassured as they left in a hurry with my brother and my incriminating reports. I knew then that I had just sealed my fate. It was time to leave the township and the country.
Thank you very much, Tenji. So this is certainly such a dramatic part of the story, and perhaps Morley, you could tell us a little bit more about what your memories are of that now, maybe any further context in terms of what was happening in South Africa at that time, and what it must have felt like to come to that realization.
Three things. First, Tenji, thank you very much for that passage. It really breaks my heart. I don't want to remember that occasion. A lot of things happened during that time, Jeff. From the 21st of March, 1960, until the day I set the police to look for me at the wrong place, which was 9th of September, 1960. Those 6 months were the most difficult months for me, because the first thing I had to do is avoid being arrested. If I succeed in not being arrested, I was also compelled to really try and work as hard as I could to regroup members of the PAC, and beyond that, also to try and talk to other political formations, the Unity Movement, the African National Congress, to find ways in which we can all cooperate, because in this period, the organizations that I'm talking about were banned, and everybody was in danger, and people were being arrested left and right. So the struggle had reached a certain point, largely because of the shootings at Sharpeville, because we suddenly realized that, you know what, these guys are determined to keep the pass system in place because it is extremely important for them to control our movements in our own land, and they'll kill for that. That's when the armed struggle started. Now, I was not part of it then, but it was clear that, you know, the organizations involved need to think hard about what is the next phase. Now, it's not easy to survive in South Africa when you do not have a pass. At that time, it wasn't, okay? So I did all sorts of things to avoid being arrested, even though twice I was arrested, but they didn't know who I was. The luck was simply that I did not allow people to take pictures of me. So it was 6 months of a very difficult period. On the day in which Tenji just read the piece about, it was the end of my journey in those 6 months. I then had to really make sure that what was in one of those reports actually takes place. In one of those reports, I was supposed to be a delegate to the Malawi Congress Party, which had its annual meetings in Malawi, which was then called Nyasaland. And this was an important conference because it was going to move towards the independence of Nyasaland into Malawi. We had done everything in terms of making sure that I had documentation that said I was a minor, okay, returning to my village with a different name, of course, and so on. I won't go into another interesting story of what happened in the process of trying to leave the country, because the police had in their hands my itinerary. They knew exactly what time I'd be catching a train in Johannesburg, going to somewhere, maybe in Bechuanaland, which is now Botswana, or in southern Rhodesia with Zimbabwe, and so on. And there was only one train that carried minors. It left Johannesburg at 3:15. The long and the short of it, by 3:15 on that day, before 3:15, the entire station was locked out by the security system. We had to find another way for me to go and catch the train at the next stop. Luckily, they were so inefficient that they did not think of going to also surround the next station. That's how I got away. From there on, the train took me to Bechuanaland, then on to southern Rhodesia, then on to Nyasaland, not by train to Nyasaland, a plane from Rhodesia to Nyasaland. And in Nyasaland, I took a boat from the bottom of the lake to the end of the lake in Beya, which is the border of Malawi or Nyasaland, and then Tanganyika. By the time I got to Tanganyika, the valid document that I had was no longer valid. I talked my way into Tanganyika and convinced the customs people to please help me. They allowed me into Tanganyika. Relative freedom from then on. Tanganyika, the TANU government was under Julius Nyerere, very magnanimous guy, really accommodated a lot of refugees. I didn't want to stay there too long. I moved on to Kenya. Kenya, same thing. In Kenya, my fortune was that I ran into somebody who was sent by the Kennedy Foundation to recruit Kenyans to the United States for their education. His name is Frank Montero. I didn't know. I was introduced to him by Tom Boyer, who was assassinated, as well as Pio Pinto, two important officials of Kano. Okay, very good guys. They introduced me to this man. This man, I didn't realize, helped me. And there was another guy traveling with me. His name was Jeff, unfortunately. Jeff now. Jeff and I were given laissez-passer by the Indian High Commissioner to go to the United Arab Republic, which is really Egypt. In Egypt, I really felt I had traveled a distance. From Egypt, I then got onto a boat across the Mediterranean to London. And that journey took me 20 months. Okay, I love because, you know, it takes you 10 hours to fly from Johannesburg to London. But under different circumstances, when you're a refugee, an exile, and a beggar, it takes you much longer.
Yeah.
Then from there, really, it's another transition, because when I arrived at the port of New York and New Jersey, sometime in mid-1962, it was a new world. Do you want me to continue?
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking. So this was a nearly a 2-year journey from South Africa through, I think you said 7 countries, eventually ending up in the United States. And you, I think you said you traveled by boat from England, right, to the United States.
That's right. Yeah.
How long was just that journey itself by boat?
That journey, it's not very pleasant because, you know, the boat we caught in Southampton, that I caught in Southampton, was not allowed to dock in Southampton. It had come from Le Havre, France. It was carrying a lot of Fulbright students who were returning to the United States after their stint in France. So we were put in a barge. There were a number of us, not many, to, and went to the boat, which was standing a distance from the moorings. And everybody was carrying luggage. I only had a briefcase in it, the papers that would allow me to enter the United States. And I don't remember what else, but that was the most important thing. So there was no luggage. And people were struggling getting up the staircase to get onto the boat. And people up there are looking at us, Little did I realize that some of them were wondering, how could this man come up onto this boat that will take 10 days to get to New York, and he doesn't have any luggage? When I got up there, the curious ones were one, George Hauser, who was for many years the executive director of American Committee on Africa. And then the other one was an Italian guy who went on to be prime minister 2 or 3 times of Italy, Giuliano.
Wow.
And then there was a writer named Fructa, and another one, Hank, somebody, I forget, please. Hank is in Los Angeles right now. He's still alive. These 4 people bugged me when I got there. They wanted to know where I came from, why wasn't I carrying any luggage, and I was really avoiding them until I caved in, and they became my best friends. By the time we got to Port of New York, New Jersey, I had a sense of what I was running into. Of course, on the ship, there were orientation programs run by Africans who had gone to the United States earlier. So, yeah. Oh, by the way, this Frank Montero guy who I met in Kenya, one of those flights that they were arranging for Kenyans to come to the United States carried Obama's father.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So this 2 years is what begins your approximately 30 years of living in exile. And I believe you'd explained that you did not believe you were going to ever necessarily be able to return to South Africa. So arriving in a new country, but I guess with some friendly ears who could hear your story must have helped in that journey to the United States. So once you arrive here, and I think you're probably going to talk a little bit more about this, but the mid 1960s, the United States was a very turbulent time. So you arrive in 1962. There's Cuban Missile Crisis, the assassination of JFK, the Civil Rights Movement. Needless to say, a very turbulent time. Yes.
Yeah.
And Vietnam War.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I really walked into a storm. I had no notion that it was that difficult in this country. My first night, I was introduced to 2 people who became very good friends of mine. One of them was Jean Buck, and her husband was Robin Buck. Bob Buck. They were producers of What's My Line, Arlene Francis's show. I came to know Arlene Francis. I came to know Arlene Francis's friend, the guy who was head of Random House, Bernard Cerf. I actually visited these people, Mount Kisco and so on. The first night I met the Buck family opened up those connections for me, okay? But more importantly, the first month at Lincoln University, which was my first stop, that was the destination. I get there in mid-August. In October, the few of us who had arrived on those scholarships are taken into a bus through Washington, D.C. to meet the Assistant Secretary of State, Soapy Williams. And Soapy Williams tells us what the whole game is all about. That's when we began to realize that we are part and parcel of the struggle between the East and the West, okay? Patrice Lumumba University had started, and now we are being taken to Lincoln University, which is a very prestigious university. I mean, people like Thurgood Marshall, Langston Hughes, the Kwame Nkrumah and others had gone to Lincoln University. I didn't know that then. I found out when I got there. That was now in, no, I said October, we went to Washington, D.C. November, there's an invitation to attend the American Negro Leadership Conference on Africa, held at Governor Harriman's estate up New York. I go there because the head of the program at Lincoln University, looking after these guys like myself, John Marker, had been invited. He's an Africanist scholar. So he says to me, Morley, why don't you come with me? I get an invitation from Brown, I forget Robert Brown, Brown's family, but name, sorry. I get to Harriman's estate, and we're waiting for the main speaker. I'm milling around and I hear these conversations from Bayard Rustons and others, and because every leader of an important Black organization was there. They are all sort of murmuring amongst themselves in surprise. How could they, for the first time in history, get together under the same roof to discuss issues that have to do with Africa instead of civil rights? You know? So I didn't understand the importance of this concern. Finally, the man they are waiting for walks in, and of course, I can't see him until he gets onto the platform. And when he starts speaking, I recognize this guy. This is the man I met in Nairobi, 1961, at the New Stanley Hotel, who was responsible for the flights of these Africans from Kenya to the United States. He was there on the Kennedy Foundation initiative because the Department of State did not want him to make that trip. Okay, so it's Frank who's giving a report on what he saw in the continent during the time when I met him. That man, the long and the short, became my surrogate father. Okay, it was at his house that Joanna and I got married, and there are important clippings in the newspapers about a Negro that marries one of the Martha, the Puritan. Okay, married a Martha's daughter, front page New Time. Wow. Frank was head of the Urban League and got married to this woman, and they lived in Riverdale. That's where we got married as well. Now I begin to learn the politics of Vietnam, anti-nuclear demonstrations, and what was it? The Cold War was really center of all these things. And then the civil rights movements and whatnot, and all the organizations that formed in the process. Now, with all the kind of politics taking place, South Africa was also involved because apartheid, like segregationists, was really being fought on campuses and so on. I had to leave Lincoln and go to Columbia University because a lot of discussions regarding South Africa and the liberation movements were taking place in the United Nations, pushed by the few African leaders, our African countries who were helping lead the liberation struggle. Guinea was very important under Sékou Touré. Okay, so I moved to Columbia University, close to the UN. Okay? And at Columbia University, I do very well. I want to be a journalist, and they no, you have to finish your bachelor's degree first. And bachelor's degree, I'm told by the Department of Political Science, we'd like you to major in political science. And I'm looking at all of this and I'm saying, I'm older than most of these kids who are here. What am I going to do with a political science degree? So against a lot of odds, my friends, powerful people, the head of the department in Columbia University and John Markham, who was the head of the program at Lincoln, why would you leave Columbia University? I said, no, I can't do that. I want a degree in economics so that if I am stuck, I can do something with it. That's how I moved to New York University and the School of Commerce. And of course, at that time, again, the politics makes it possible for me to meet with Joanna. And we find ourselves compatible and also having the same interests. And that's how we dated and finally decided to get married. And then, of course, the interesting story about that is that I said to her, listen, I'm not going to stay in this country forever. Somewhere in the process, we have to leave and go to the continent. So why don't we all both get into doctoral programs? But before we even go too far, you better go to South Africa and see whether you could survive there. She went to South Africa in 1970, met my father.
Wow.
And my father said, my daughter, so, fine, I've seen this young white lady, and I won't go to the questions that he asked. You can conjecture that yourself. And we got married at Frank Montero's house, October 24th, 1970. Okay. Then we get in our doctoral programs. We're both very active politically, both on anti-junta Greek politics, including the student politics that I really pursued hard because of disinvestment and investment in South Africa. And then in addition, solidarity with other liberation movements, as well as student movements in the United States. So we spent a lot of time being politically active, but also very serious academics. In fact, Joanna was in a program with Amy's sister at the graduate school. And that's how we met Amy, through Rita being a classmate of Joanna. Yeah. And then from then on, really, I went to work for the largest international consulting firm at that time, unknowingly. And it was just a fluke because I finished my bachelor's degree. There were no scholarships for master's degrees. And the African American Institute said, listen, we have an opening in a firm called Louis Berger International in East Orange. Why don't you go and see them? So I go and see the president of Louis Berger International, Dr. Berger, and Darish Wolf, his nephew. And they didn't even ask, about the job or anything. They want to know about me. Where do I come from? How did I get to East Orange, New Jersey? And that went very well at Horn and Hardart, which was
sure. The automat.
Yeah, there was. Yeah. And I got the job as the director of the training program for interns, Africans who were coming from different countries.
Wow.
But that was what prompted me to go for an MBA at Rutgers. And I did that in 1 year, and I had my MBA.
Mm-hmm.
From then on,
So Morley, I'm just going to interrupt you there for 1 second. So I think this is so interesting, the choice to not follow what others are suggesting you pursue in terms of a degree in politics, and following that path, and making the choice to pursue further degrees in economics so that you had a foundation by which you could support yourself. So can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of that decision that you made and what your interest was in economics?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's timely too, Jeff, because at Louis Berger International, they were the largest contracting firm for civil engineering and development work for USAID. Okay, so they had a huge footprint. And when they started taking these African interns, it's because they wanted to develop economists who could go back to their country and do whatever work has to be done, and if need be, fall back on the information and knowledge and the support that Louis Berger would provide. I'm not guessing that because I did that in South Africa when at one stage the provinces, you call them states here, were going through the need for development plans. One of the best development plans that they had came from me, Morley Associates, in collaboration with Louis Berger. Okay, wow. It became a blueprint for other provinces. The only problem was that they really plagiarized it and could not implement it. Okay, I know this because I was advisor to the guy who was the real director general of an important province. I won't go into that detail. But what I'm saying now is that Louis Berger was very well positioned as a place where people like myself could pick up skills as development economists who would then go back to their respective countries and contribute to the development of those countries. And indeed, it did happen. Okay.
Yeah, so I think that's I guess one question I would have is that was there I gather some of your thinking was that with developing these skills and knowledge and degrees, there was the possibility of returning A to Africa or B potentially to South Africa to put your economic development skills to work there. Were you thinking long term like that, or was that something which developed over time?
It's something that drove me. It developed very early on, but I was lucky enough to have opportunities to actually do that. The first opportunity was when I was recruited by Harry Belafonte to be part of USA for Africa. I was the only African in the Africa board that reviewed proposals that came from people who wanted assistance in the continent. And Harry would say to me, well, you go to these different countries from West Africa down to Sudan and look at the projects that we intend to find or projects that we have funded and are in operation to make sure that things are working. That gave me an additional confidence to develop as a development economist. But when Ford Foundation later gave me a grant to do an independent study on economic integration in sub-Saharan Africa, there I was helped by a very nice man who passed on now, Wayne Fredericks. If you look that name up, you will see he was an important person in the administration at that time. When I leave and go to the continent, it's because that grant allowed me to take my family with me. They went and stayed in Zimbabwe. I worked out of Lusaka in what was called the preferential trade area for Eastern and Southern Africa. It had to do with lowering the tariffs of trade amongst those countries that were trying to form a union, which is the same effort now that you see the common market for Eastern Southern Africa called COMESA, okay? It started with PTA. I was a development economist and a specialist in promoting intra-African trade in 1988-89 in the PTA. So I have a long history in that area. Again, if I didn't have the background that I had, the economics degree from NYU, and the training from Louis Berger, and the opportunity to work with USA of Africa and get very practical experience of what development is all about, okay? It varied. I would not have been able to hold the position of being a special advisor in the secretariat of the PTA. In that context, again, I am introduced to how chambers work. We include in our meetings of the PTA, Federation of Chambers of Commerce and Industry, inviting South African Chambers of Commerce and Industry, where we see two chambers coming, a black one and a white one. And we meet them separately. And at the end of the day, myself and the general secretary of the organization come to a conclusion that, you know what, they live in two separate worlds.
Yeah.
The black chamber is almost really non-existent. It's just like an agglomeration of people who are desperately trying to find space, but they are way behind. And the white chamber is very successful. And the only chamber that could have competed with the South African white chamber would have been the chamber of Mauritius. Mauritius was ahead.
So in terms of our timeline here, so it's 1962, you arrive here in the United States, you're pursuing your education. At what time is it that you then move you and your family back to Africa? What sort? 1980s?
1988.
1988. Okay.
And I don't like to remember that date because for some reason, Joanna and I agreed that I should go first and she would come after me. So I leave this poor woman with the responsibility of packing up a brownstone that we had in Hoboken alone. Can you imagine how much work?
Hmm.
By the time she finished and got onto the plane with the 2 kids, she was dead.
Hmm.
How she did it, I don't know.
Wow.
Yeah. So she goes to Harare, and I, of course, help in Harare, but I work out of Lusaka. Now, in Harare itself, it was very interesting because, one, she and I got involved in helping the launching of the Indigenous Business Development Council. This was Black business coming together in Zimbabwe and saying to the government, listen, it's 10 years now. We see no difference in the structure of multinationals, white national companies, and ourselves on the side. Something needs to be done. Again, the South Africans were invited, particularly Black Chamber of Commerce, to be part and parcel of the launching of the EIBDC. Not only did we do that, but I also got involved in being a consultant in the beginnings of what was called the African Capacity Building Foundation. This was something was sponsored by Jay Cox at the World Bank and a few other economists who felt that African countries needed to have people who are skilled to help them develop the appropriate policies and so on. And you've got to build an institution that will be sufficiently attractive to entice some of them to come back from Europe and the United States to work, because the conditions and the remuneration and whatnot would be comparable. Okay, I was the first consultant under the leadership of the first governor, Black governor of the Reserve Bank of Ghana, Frimpong Ansa, and I became the chief consultant there. And unfortunately, I identified 2 important sectors: the electrical sector, ZESA, and the iron sector too. And I was just about to begin that when suddenly I'm given an offer from the Black Chamber in South Africa to please come and be the director of the Management Leadership Development Council. And I turn out to be that as well as executive director of the chamber. That's how I get back to South Africa.
Okay, so I was wondering what that piece was. So this, I want to maybe have you explain a little bit. So this 1988 leading up to, I think it's 1991 is when you returned to South Africa. So during roughly that time, what is life like inside South Africa during that time? Can you just give us a synopsis of sort of up until that point when you did have the opportunity to return?
From where we were, we really couldn't see the data, but all we knew that was incredible excitement because the political prisoners had been released and the organizations they led had been unbanned. And therefore, exiles like ourselves had to come back. In fact, just last night, we were talking with Jeff and Amy and Joanna, who was leading the discussion in terms of there was a process for us coming from outside to be integrated. I mean, we had to fill in forms, support who we were, and so on. Unlike the people who were in South Africa, where the release was just get them out of prison and they couldn't go home and so on. In our case, we really had to be processed to come back. But there was no bad feelings about it because at least I knew we were going to South Africa and we had a job. We also were lucky enough to have my brother and my sister-in-law willing to accommodate us, because when you return from another country, the question is where you're going to live. What kind of a job do you have? Where are your children going to school? We sorted these out very quickly by just having our brother introduce us, first house us, then introduce us to people who helped us, okay? The commute from Johannesburg to where Nafcock was killing, but I did that, all right? And then fortunately, down the line, Joanna was given a job as I don't know what the title was, but she worked at the Human Science Research Council. And she was very, very instrumental in changing the extent to which Blacks were excluded from that council by forming a group some of the people that she worked with have become very successful and important politically and economically in the country. And then that's when I started also. When I finished with NAVCOG, I didn't succeed because of the internecine struggles, political struggles in the chamber. And I began to realize why the guy who recruited me who was president of the chamber, didn't want me to be the executive secretary. He wanted me to take this new institution, Management Leadership Development Council, that was funded very well by the German South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Absolute magnificent building and everything about it. So I had to find somebody to take that position because I was too busy with 2 jobs, that and so on. When I finished with that, I then moved on quickly to do work as, what was I now? I think after NAVCOG, I went and became the chairman of the National Economic Policy, South Africa. It was formed by the alliance of the ANC, South African Communist Party, and the Congress of Trade Unions. Now, that was yeah, sorry, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I was just going to ask Morley. I think one of the interesting things here is you had this this extensive period of your life in exile, much of that in the United States. So that really gave you some unique experiences and perspectives that you brought with you when you returned to South Africa. Can you talk a little bit about that? And I think you referenced it a bit earlier, but in terms of the education that you got and the things that you learned and experienced in the U.S. and how that was perhaps an asset or helped you in terms of your return to Africa and to South Africa.
All right, I'll select 2 or 3 places where it became evident. At one stage in the year 2000, I'm asked by the Minister of Education to be the principal or the vice chancellor of an African university, University of the Transkei. It was the worst performing institution in the country. It had all sorts of problems. It didn't have a council. Management was fractured. The coursework really did not relate to the needs of the community. But unfortunately, that tenure was only for 1 year. I walked in, created a new management structure, did everything I could because the university was the second largest employer after the municipality. Tried to have these 2 work together. The municipality was waddling because the people who were in charge really did not have experience. And the academics sitting up on the mountain themselves did not have practical experience. Now, having worked in the United States where, at the business school at Rutgers, I was part of an effort that rebuilt downtown Newark, okay? I had an idea of how you can work within a community and assist rebuilding the community in many different ways. So I created a bridge, but it was very difficult because the people on the political side in the municipality were mortified at seeing these academics wanting to work with them. Of course, the academics were also looking a little down on the guys in the community and so on. At one stage, when President Mbeki came to visit the institution, he raised the question of, to what extent are you working with the local municipality? And I said to him, I am, but I'm having the problems that they perceive one another not as complementing each other in the effort of development, but competing interests. I tried to go over that and succeeded up to a certain point, but the direction the university should have taken, really they didn't take it. The university should have done something about the location where it was. There are other things which it should have specialized in. For instance, in the area of fisheries and whatnot. There were individual people in departments who would go and consult at Port St. John's. And I said to them, why are you doing it on an individual basis? Pull yourselves together as a group from the university to assist the local municipality. That's one area in which my experience was useful. It was also useful in the attempts to formulate a really relevant relevant political economic growth model. Okay, I was not alone. I worked with other people who were very familiar with what economic development is all about, and who also knew where we were, the transition that was taking place, what it required, because they'd come from outside. They were not like the insiders who really did not know what the movements of the other economic interests in the world were. I mean, as a student of multinational corporations, I knew the direction. Now, many of them did not have that opportunity. Okay. Now, that's a second place where the skill was very important. Third was really important for purposes of my own self. I was brought into the private sector by a company that was very big in terms of retailing, services, and what was it now? Merchandising and whatnot. And then I got involved in the banking industry. I got involved in the mining industry, which really was a very big challenge because I was in charge of safety, health, and environment, and so on. And in these areas, I brought a lot of knowledge. In mining, in particular, because my dissertation had to do with the labor structure in the gold mines, I knew what I was getting into. But it was from an academic point of view when I wrote the dissertation. Here was a practical experience of going 3 kilometers down to see how miners work and how labor is structured. What are the safety features? What are the health features? What kind of environment you operate in?
Wow.
So I can count a number of instances where this education was extremely helpful.
Yeah.
And now it's still also very helpful because I'm preoccupied with the idea of de-densifying townships. Remember I said to you, our people are only in the 17% of the land. Okay, 83 is still in white hands. That transformation has not taken place. In the meantime, the Black population is rising. In the meantime, if you look at all the indices that tell you about the health of a nation, we have the highest unemployment in the world. Maybe not in the world, but the highest amongst in the world, other countries. We have the biggest inequalities of income and wealth. We have the largest poverty that you can ever talk about. These indices just keep growing because the structure that needs to be changed has not been addressed. And I'm not the only person saying that. The World Bank has a report on township economies. They compare one township in South Africa with another one in India. The introduction in that report, I think it was out in 2015, asks the question why we in South Africa have not addressed this structural imbalance, spatial imbalance. Okay? And they show through the example of the African township the extent to which things really are getting bad.
So this, I'm sure, must have been, I mean, as much as there's this incredible opportunity to help build economic development now that you've been able to return to South Africa, but and I think you're just describing them right now. Can you talk a little bit more? Just what were some of the specific structural challenges that still existed in South Africa that you encountered initially, and it sounds like South Africa is still confronting today?
Well, we can start first with the issue of land. Until we sort out the issue of land, I can't see us making much progress. If you were to ask me, what's the end game? I don't know because of that. Secondly, the extent to which we have destroyed human capital by keeping it in these townships is unbelievable. Okay, we will never be able to evaluate the cost of that. Third is the extent to which our educational system has not really caught up with the kind of changes that are taking place. By the time I get to the health sector, you will realize that those townships that I'm talking about invariably do not have the best health services that people are needing. Okay? Now we're confronted with fairly basic problems, you know, the uncertainty of how much water is available. South Africa is an arid country, and a person who knows better than I do about that is Joanna. She's done excellent work on that. But also, we have a problem with electricity. I just read recently that GDP growth has gone down 3.2% in South Africa because of the intermittent availability of electricity. Now, when you look at those kinds of things, you say to yourself, what the hell? I mean, any country without a consistent supply of electricity and water is in trouble.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
we are in that category. I wish I was exaggerating.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
I think it does. Absolutely. I mean, it's you know, it's illustrates very well that you know, I don't know how much you would attribute it to the fact that sort of where we started off, that there has been sort of structures in place in South Africa for centuries. And that to unwind those and unravel those and break those down is certainly not something that happens very quickly.
Exactly. Now, we are still left with the legacy of segregation
Right.
of one kind or another.
Yeah.
That's a structural problem that needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
We're trying as best as we can, but you know, it's bits and pieces that benefit largely people who've decided they will work with the system, the elite, okay? And the vast majority of the people are not benefiting from that.
Right.
If they are, it's minimal.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think we will sort of pause here for a second. I just have to again, what an incredible and fascinating and as I said, inspiring life story and journey you have had and continue to have. So I just I know that we're on Zoom, but this is a point where I would want to ask everybody to give you a round of applause for sharing your story with us tonight. We're going to definitely get to some questions, get maybe deeper into some of these topics, but it has been just such a pleasure to have you share your story with us, because I think it you know, it illustrates so much of what is happening in our world, both not only in South Africa, but many other parts of the world as well. I would certainly, I think, include even the United States here as well. And that might be one of my first questions that we get to. But what I want to do is just to remind folks, if you have any questions or comments, you can feel free to type those into the chat. For those who are downstairs, you can write questions onto some of the note cards there, share it with the staff there, and then they can add those into our chat. So as I just was mentioning, and this is something that we had spoken about a bit. So Morley and I have had I think two meetings to get to know each other, and for me to try to absorb you know, some of the history and information that he shared. But one of the things we talked about was the way in which as the apartheid system was being developed and established, I have an understanding that there was a studies done of the Jim Crow segregation laws here in the United States to see how that system works. I think because of its effectiveness and what it was able to do in terms of again, this was sort of control of the part of the population here in the United States. But I think what's very significant is that in terms of the demographics, in terms of the population in South Africa, as you mentioned, it's a completely different you know, population breakdown. So the fact that these laws and structures here in the United States were then, you know, being used to formulate a similar structure in South Africa. Anyway, maybe you could talk a little bit more about that in terms of ways in which I think you also mentioned that there was the engineering skills of miners in the U.S. that was used as well in South Africa. So maybe you could just start by talking a little bit more about both of those.
Do you want to go to the questions first, or you want me to?
So let's see.
I'm looking at the time.
Yeah, we certainly have time. We have I'm just going to start off that question, and then hopefully people will continue to add some questions. I don't see any in the chat right now.
Okay.
But I encourage folks, again, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to just type those into the chat.
Now, one has to remember that the colonialists did not just come from nowhere. They came from countries that had already done a few things and so on. So that, for instance, when you look at the development of the mining industry, it starts with the copper mines in South Africa, but that copper was mined and sent to Cornwall in England, where it was processed. It doesn't take too long before some beneficiation takes place in South Africa before the copper gets to Cornwall. I don't really know when, but once diamonds are discovered, shortly after the copper was discovered, Kimberley becomes the center point for all those people who had mining skills in diamond mines. Okay, they come from all over. The Brazilian diamond mines were then peaking out. So people moved, Europeans in particular, from every part of the world to Kimberley. Okay, it's not as simple as that. That evolved also. Initially, there were Afrikaners who staked out claims there. All right. And these claims were hodgepodge, one next to the other, and they would collapse because the water would fill them up. Now, I'm talking about places that I actually visited where the water still fills up. Now, here comes a person called Cecil Rhodes, and he's sent to South Africa for health reasons to recover. And he goes up to Kimberley and notices that, there's one little mine. It's not even mine, a hole here and there, and they are collapsing. And they have problems with water. So he says, listen, guys, I'll sell you pumps to get rid of the water, but I want so much of what you find. The long and the short of it, he collected so many of those little diamond diggings. They were called diggings at the time. And the long short of it, it becomes the Kimberley Diamond Mine.
Wow.
But the Kimberley Diamond Mine has to go a little deeper than alluvial mining.
Mm-hmm.
Who does it go to? Comes to the Americans and says, listen, you guys have experience in deep level mining. Can you please come in? They come, they set up pumps, they set up all sorts of things. And of course, the people who own the shares in these diamond mines, when they hear that it's a decade or so later that the gold discovered in the Transvaal, they descend on it. They bring all those skills, but in addition to that, international capital comes in now because the gold standard is in place and it needs newly minted gold. And most of the newly minted gold at that time came from South Africa. Now, if you just look at the evolution of the diamond mine, of the mining industry, and all the other related industries that grow with it along the line,
Mm-hmm.
and all the incredible business opportunities that arise, and how international they can be in terms of connections. You're not surprised, as I told Jeff Bass the other day, that, the compounds in which Cecil Rhodes and the father to Harry Oppenheimer kept these Africans who came from British South Africa locked up for the duration of the contracts. The concept of compounds was taken from the Panama Canal. They went and saw what happened with black labor that was used in digging the canal and how you can really ring fence it. The deep level mines in the West, right? When I forget the first law against fracking in California meant that a lot of miners with skills, they didn't have any jobs. So diamond mines in South Africa, the gold mines in South Africa offer British capital a wonderful opportunity to recruit them.
Mm.
Some of the best American mining engineers became consulting engineers on the Witwatersrand. W.E. Grace walks around in 1902 in Johannesburg and says, gee, this looks like a Yankee town, because most of the large mines were run by Yankees.
Wow. Wow.
Does
I
that
mean,
answer the question?
yeah, I think it does. And I think it just illustrates how much of, you know, history is certainly way more complex than I think we often are initially taught. And there's so many parts of the story that are left out.
Yeah.
And I think it's helpful to hear, from your perspective, more about that. So we actually have a couple of questions here in the chat that I want to get to. So the first one is, what would you do differently today for South Africa's independence compared to what you did as a young man? Would you advocate nonviolence like Mandela?
I don't think there's any need for violence. Our numbers are such that, and our demands are such that they are absolutely obvious. I think we have to really build up a more formidable body politics in South Africa. No more, no less. Okay? Violence, no.
Yeah. Yeah. But there's a I want to make sure if I can find it here. When you were describing and uh the again, as you just pointed out, the huge population difference between the black and white populations in South Africa. There is a I'm gonna probably not pronounce this correctly, but Swart Givar.
Swart Gepar.
Can you explain what that is?
When the National Party, that is the Afrikaners, took over in 1948, they had been talking about the black population posing a huge danger to their own existence. Now, I'm reminded of a book written by Alistair Park, The Rise and Fall of Apartheid, in which he says the dividing line in South Africa's thinking is whites being afraid that their civilization will be destroyed by the barbarians. Okay? Now, that in itself captures whites looked at us as a black danger and still look at us as a black danger because they're insecure.
Mm-hmm.
They've had all these privileges at our expense.
Mm-hmm.
And they are not about to let go, which is understandable. But the question of redistributing the wealth of the country from the land to the economy is going to take a long time. Mm. That has to be done if South Africa has to find its own trajectory in the Committee of Nations. Mm-hmm. I say this with absolute fervor, because it's such a beautiful country. It has such a great potential that, I can't see it otherwise. Mm-hmm. As we're talking now, I'm busy working on trying to make sure that the rail logistics in Southern Africa are harmonized, because suddenly there is the demand for these minerals that are going to be very important in the transition that we are seeing into renewable energy. A good amount of those are in Southern Africa. And South Africa is an important part and player in the logistics systems that move those commodities out of the country. But not just move them in the raw form. I'm insisting that forms of beneficiation where there is value should take place. You create much more value and many more jobs and so on. But you can talk about those things, Jeff, if you don't have the technical know-how, the education that develops the technical know-how. You can talk till cows come back home, as we say in Zulu.
Yeah.
So yep. These are related things. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very interrelated. So another question we have here in the chat, given problems with electric grid and water availability, does South Africa have any partnerships with environmental engineering groups and or similar programs at universities to help remedy these problems?
Yes, we have groups and universities that are partially, I mentioned that, partially involved in this. Um, but the block really is the government policies. They have not been consistent, and they have not been forward looking as much as they should have. I mean, Joanna could tell you better than I could that, years back, she wrote a beautiful paper for a magazine called The Thinker, in which she was saying the taps are going to run dry. This is some years back. But you would have thought that, they would suddenly say, hey, let's talk about it. Your information says this. What should be done about it? There's a huge, not a huge, there's a conference now that is going to review water resources in South Africa. It's called by the Water Council of South Africa. And I'm invited to participate. I says to them, I'm just a development economist. I know nothing about water. Why don't you try and get my partner to come and participate in this? Again, they hem and they hawed and whatnot. There were a few people who knew what they were talking about. But what was really devastating was that the Minister of Water Affairs didn't show up. His Director General did not show up. So what message do you send to a group of people, professors and whatnot, and people who head water departments across the country, sitting and talking about reviewing water policy in the past 5 years in order to see where we're going to in the next 5 years? And the government is not represented.
Wow.
What do you do?
Yeah.
I mean, it would be totally irresponsible of me to say things like this if they really didn't happen. But I'm engaged. We are engaged in this.
Mm-hmm.
What we see is not really pleasant.
Yeah. Well, I can certainly at best sort of empathize that. I must, in terms of the life story that we've had the pleasure of learning about tonight, just how I'm sure deeply frustrating that must be for you to have the desire, to have the will, to have the skills and the knowledge of what needs to happen and change, but to have so many of those other parts that are that need to change as well. I think that must, I'm sure, be a very a frustrating experience. And
Jeff, my last word is I take comfort from the reality that in many, many instances, we wake up to something that is happening and people say it's fantastic, but they don't realize how much time and effort was put into it. I'm in that zone now, okay? And I'm just hoping I live long enough to see some of the things I'm doing accomplished.
Yeah, well, I think I know that we when we were putting our this program together, I know that we were faced with the challenge of how to cover, because I mean there's probably a half dozen at least more stories that could have been added to illustrate various different chapters here that you've shared today. But I think that I want to pat ourselves on the back. We were able to cover, the whole story there, and I think obviously there's much more as I think you've been describing much more deeper issues that are at play here, historical trends, so much that is part of your individual, your personal story. And I again, as I said, I found it inspiring to learn, what journey you've been on and where it's brought you today, and your willingness to continue to work hard to make the world a better place. I think that it is certainly a tribute to you and your family, and I really appreciate you sharing all of this with us today. So I'm just going to check with our folks downstairs. I don't see any more questions here in the chat, so I think we'll probably begin to start to wrap this up. There's a comment we just got. Thank you. Very interesting program and insight on a complex country and history.
Very true.
Very true. Absolutely.
Yeah. Listen, Jeff, from me, this has also been educational because when you have a conversation of this kind, and you have questions that people ask you, it really sort of makes you go back and look at things and figure out what's missing, because there's never a complete picture. There's
Right.
always something that
Absolutely.
should add to it. So it's also been an education for me, and I appreciate you jogging my memory so hard.
Yeah. Well, no, it was a pleasure. As I said, I think we are happy that you were willing to let us record tonight's program. For those who are joining us and you know someone who you think would enjoy this program, just give us a couple of weeks, hopefully, and we'll get this this video edited and posted to our YouTube page, so that we can share this story with even more folks. I want to, of course, make sure to thank Tenji for joining us today and for reading the passages from your book. I have a couple more comments I'm going to read here. Such a special person. You did a great interview. And then this is another comment. Morley, I have never forgotten John, is it Dubai? Doobie. John Doobie. So I think your story has certainly resonated with a number of people that that joined us tonight. And again, we're in a virtual world right now, but I certainly hope you can imagine the roughly 40 other people that have joined us tonight, and that they've gotten something out of this as well, and it's something that will perhaps pique their interest to learn more, and to just be more understanding of what our shared world history is.
Wonderful. Jeff, thanks a million.
Well, thank you. I want to thank the Friends of the Library. I want to thank Amy and Jeff Bass. And again, as I said, I want to thank Tenji for joining us as well. But most of all, Morley, thank you so much. This has been a terrific event. I've been looking forward to this. And thank you again. Thanks on the part of the library.
My pleasure.